So good afternoon, everybody. My name's Steve Greenlee. I'm the president of ExxonMobil Exploration and the chairman of the Energy Advisory Board here at the University of Houston. So as all of you know, the university has invested substantial resources in being a leader in energy, all things energy. And with that, a lot of focus on graduate, undergraduate education, research, and outreach. And this is a part and probably one of the underpinnings of outreach at the University of Houston. And as you know, there are some really complicated problems in energy. The university is committed to being a hub of trying to get solutions to those problems, to be a locus of conversation. And because they're complicated, we elected some time ago, about 3 years ago when we started this, that we were not going to have an individual speaker. Rather, we were going to have panel discussions so we could air all the complexities associated with this, the different sides, and let you make up your mind on kind of how these problems should be considered as you run down the road. So I think you'll find this one very interesting. This one is the Clean Power Plan, to be or not to be. And we have a really interesting group of speakers. And the moderator is Tracy Hester, who is a professor of environmental law and emerging technology here at the University of Houston Law Center. So with that, I'll turn it over to Tracy, and he'll moderate the program. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Tracy Hester, and it's a pleasure to be here tonight and to see all of you here as well. We're here to talk about essentially the linchpin of the administration's efforts to deal with greenhouse gas emissions from the U.S. economy. In that light, the hottest ticket in town, D.C., next week is not to a theater, it's not to a show, it's to the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. We are looking at a full review of the entire court of a rule package that EPA has promulgated that is designed to substantially reduce emissions of greenhouse gas emissions from a particular power sector, essentially fossil-fueled power generators. We're going to discuss that plan tonight, the judicial review of it, and what paths might lie ahead as that plan is under review. With that, we have a fabulous panel to review that with us tonight. It's my pleasure. I will introduce each of them now, and then each of them will have an opportunity to offer about 6 to 8 minutes of initial thoughts, and then we'll begin questions and answers. In that sense, I want to give you a chance to start thinking of your own questions. You may notice that in your brochures, we actually have a mechanism set up so that you can provide your questions electronically. So if you'll take a look, it's on the interior side of your programs. Essentially, send your questions to uh.edu/energy/ask. We've done this the past couple of panels, and I will say that we've had extraordinary good luck at very penetrating and insightful questions. We've also had good luck in that we've had about 10 times as many questions as we can possibly answer. So put yours in early and put them in well. So with that, let me introduce our speakers for tonight. Our first speaker is going to be Dr. Al Armendariz. He is the Deputy Regional Director of the Sierra Club's Beyond Coal campaign, and he directs the initiative to end the use of coal and expand renewable energy in Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, and Oklahoma. He also does other things as well. He has led the charge to push Austin Energy to expand its use of renewable energy and to drop coal-fired power. And he's also been involved in other fights, particularly in Plaquemines Parish, to keep out-of-state coal companies from building new coal export terminals. Prior to joining Sierra Club, those of you in the audience, I see some familiar faces from the Environmental Bar, may recall that he was the regional director for EPA Region 6 in Dallas. And in that capacity, oversaw EPA's permitting programs and enforcement for our state regional areas. He is, before that, a fellow from academia, so it's nice to have someone with roots in the classroom. Dr. Armendariz taught at Southern Methodist University of Engineering, and he has a degree in chemical engineering as a bachelor's, as well as from Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Our second speaker is going to be John Hall. And John has been gracious enough to step in for Vicki Patton, who unfortunately for family reasons was not able to join us tonight. John is an icon in Texas. And I hope I'm not embarrassing you by saying that, but he's very well known. Going far back to the point where he was actually the chair of the predecessors to the Texas Commission of Environmental Quality, which at that time was the TNRCC, and then he went for the Texas Water Board, if I remember correct. Texas Water Commission, excuse me. He has also been actively involved in issues since that time period, and I will ask him as well to fill in his resume as we go along. I will simply say that he has been a key player in environmental policy in Texas, as well as on water rights and allocation issues for certainly about 20 years or more. Our third speaker is also someone who probably needs no introduction, but I'll do it anyway, Jeff Homestead. Jeff is a partner at the law firm of Bracewell LLP. He's up in their DC office, and Jeff is currently the head of the Environmental Strategies Group, where he advises a large collection of energy and other companies on how to comply with environmental laws. Previously, he worked in the White House of George H.W. Bush. We had to make sure we have the right Bushes delineated here. And he was involved in writing and developing the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments, which are actually some of the operative language we'll be discussing here tonight. In addition as well, he also worked on the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is the operative framework treaty that governs many of the climate negotiations that have taken place since, including the Paris Agreements, which may come up in our discussions tonight. He also spent a good amount of time within EPA, where he was the EPA Assistant Administrator for Air and Radiation. And your program doesn't say it, but he has the distinction of being the longest serving Assistant Administrator in that position in the history of the agency, and is widely viewed as one of the world's wide experts in the Clean Air Act. He has bachelor's degrees in English, which always warms my heart to see someone with that background. Those liberal arts majors out there, take hope, there's lots of opportunities for you. And economics from Brigham Young University, and then his law degree from Yale Law School. Then our final speaker is Mark Walters, who is senior counsel at Jackson Walker. He is focused on state and federal regulatory issues and emphasizes environment and related litigation. He's worked in the broad gamut of environmental statutes, but one interesting thing is that he also has walked the other side of the aisle. He was previously with the Texas Attorney General's office. For 6 years, he represented the state of Texas in various environmental litigation. He has a bachelor's of fine arts with distinction from the University of Oklahoma, and a law degree with honors from the University of Texas School of Law. With that, I've asked each of our speakers to take about 6 to 8 minutes to offer their initial thoughts on the Clean Power Plan, both its predicates and reasons for its passage, and what likely thoughts they have in mind for how the plan will fare in judicial review and future implementation. Keeping this as fair as possible, we decided to do this alphabetically. So Dr. Armendariz, you get the mic first.
Great, thank you. And I want to thank the University of Houston, and thank you, Tracy, for the invitation to speak. I'm very, very happy to be here tonight. The Clean Power Plan. The Clean Power Plan is one aspect, one very important aspect of the EPA's efforts to reduce carbon emissions. Carbon emissions are the leading cause of climate change. The climate change on our planet, in my assessment, is one of the most, if not the most critical policy issue that the globe has to deal with right now. So this is a very timely discussion. I'm very glad that we're having it here in Houston. So dealing with climate change is absolutely critical. We need to reduce our carbon emissions. This country is the largest cumulative source of the carbon pollution that we have in our atmosphere. The state of Texas is the largest of all 50 states in terms of carbon emissions from the United States. And so we have a special responsibility as Texans, a special responsibility as Americans to the global effort to reduce our carbon emissions to deal with the problem of climate change. And so the Clean Power Plan is an effort by this EPA to reduce emissions of carbon dioxide from one part of the American system of emissions, and that being from electric utilities. Electric utilities are the largest single source of emissions of carbon dioxide into our atmosphere, and the Clean Power Plan is an effort by the EPA that has been now on the books for about a year to reduce emissions by approximately 1/3 by the year 2030. So it's not a rule that requires 100% elimination of carbon emissions. It doesn't require those emissions to be reduced tomorrow. It's a very gradual reduction of about 1% per year in total aggregate emissions between now and 2030 over the next 15 years. There are many critics in the environmental community who don't think it goes far enough. There are certainly others many in industry who think that the rule itself goes too far. In terms of how it arose, where did it come from? The EPA under former Administrator Lisa Jackson really felt like the country had let carbon emissions go unregulated for far too long, and that there was an obligation after the Supreme Court ruled in Massachusetts versus EPA to reduce carbon emissions. And so the Clean Power Plan, along with other efforts by this administration to reduce emissions from cars and trucks, to reduce emissions from heavy-duty engines. There's actually a new effort to reduce emissions from aircraft engines. That, what you're seeing now is an EPA that's trying to catch up. The science behind climate change has been very solid for many decades, but unfortunately our regulators have not taken strong action. And so the Clean Power Plan that we have is one piece of the suite of rules that this EPA and this White House have put forward to reduce carbon emissions, to reduce the worst impacts of climate change. In terms of the necessity of it, and this is where I'll wrap up my opening remarks, there are many reasons why we need to tackle climate change, but I thought one that I would flag tonight is the financial impact of climate change and the cost of inaction. And so if you look at just numbers from 2012, so these are annual numbers for the United States in 2012, there were $20 billion in congressional disaster appropriations, money that's coming from all of us who pay taxes, $10 billion that went into the National Flood Insurance Program, another $20 billion that went into the Federal Crop Insurance Program to deal with the drought that we experienced here in Texas and many other states on the Great Plains. So just in 2012, if you cumulatively looked at how much climate and weather disasters were costing our country, it was actually over $100 billion. It's $100 billion that we didn't spend on education, on healthcare, on national defense, on homeland security, or other national priorities. And there are also impacts that are happening to countries that have very little responsibility for climate change. The United States has emitted more carbon into our atmosphere since the start of the Industrial Revolution than any other, and in fact, by far than any other. And yet there are countries around the world where there are rising seas, where there are droughts, where there are floods, impacting communities that have very little responsibility. And so I feel as Americans, we have a responsibility not only to ourselves and future generations of Americans, but to make sure that we do our fair share and in fact lead the effort to eliminate these emissions that right now are altering the climate. And so with that, I'll just go ahead and wrap up my remarks. Again, I'm very happy to be here today, and I look forward to the question and answer.
Thank you, Dr. Armendariz.
Good afternoon. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. It was not my plan earlier to be here today. My colleague, Vicki Patton, sent me an email. She's one of my favorite persons, and advised me that her father had passed and she couldn't be here and she needed me to stand in her place. She's much more attractive and beautiful than I am, and I certainly cannot match her intellect. But let me share a few thoughts with you. I have had the fortunate opportunity to work on clean energy, clean air issues in this state for the past 25 years. Because of our phenomenal population and economic growth, our huge industrial base, air quality issues in Texas are the most challenging in the country. Around the year 2000, I was very much engaged in this region as efforts were put together to try to comply with the 1-hour ozone standard. And the TCEQ, Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, under the leadership of former President George W. Bush, who was governor at the time, put together a clean air plan for the Houston area that called for, among other things, started off being a 90% reduction in one of the pollutants that contributed to ozone formation. Subsequently, it was reduced to 80%, and even with that, there were broad proclamations made that said, if these regulations are implemented, every refinery and every chemical plant in the greater Houston area and along the Gulf Coast will shut down and move elsewhere. Here we are, 15 years later, and what we have seen is phenomenal growth in petrochemicals and in refining capacity. Our refineries have expanded, the petrochemical companies have expanded, and they're making more product and money than ever before. What happened? Texas Innovation and Science was used to develop a cost-effective solution to a very complicated problem. Our industrial base became more competitive, and we have seen phenomenal growth in terms of more jobs for Texans, more income for Texans, and we have today, we have an industrial base that other states are envious of. We solve a very difficult problem because we use technology and a can-do attitude that said, we can get this done, and instead of shutting down the economy, we can in fact grow it as we have. We skip forward to the Clean Power Plan. And there are those who are making the same dire predictions, saying that this regulation will cause the cost of energy, electricity costs to go up 200 to 300%, and the sky will fall, the world will come to an end. So let me tell you where we are. Utilizing data that is published on a regular basis by the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, the best grid operator in the state, and utilizing an analytical tool financed and vetted by the utility sector itself. We've over the past year, utilizing those tools, utilizing ERCOT data, we pulled back and say, let's just roll up our sleeves and do an objective analysis to find out where Texas stands with regard to the Clean Power Plan. Utilizing ERCOT's data and that industry-vetted and financed tool, which I may add is very conservative, it showed that Texas, under business-as-usual conditions, in terms of what is already happening, back in August of 2015, we were 88% on track to compliance without doing anything different from what was already happening. So we raised the hypothetical question, and we said, okay, if the state is already basically 90% there, what additional measures could be undertaken to bring about full compliance? We knew that energy efficiency is the most cost-effective energy resource we had, and so we utilized that model, and we said, what level of energy efficiency will be required to get to full compliance? Showed 7%. And then we did an analysis to determine what level of energy efficiency we are on track to achieve in this state under business-as-usual current policy conditions. It showed that because of private investments being made and approved by the Public Utility Commission of Texas by the utilities, because of the aggressive energy efficiency programs of CPS Energy of San Antonio and Austin Energy of the City of Austin, and then coupled with the building codes that the Texas legislature adopted last legislative session, we are on track to achieve more than 7% energy efficiency by the date of compliance of the CPP. You put that together with what is happening because of increased utilization of natural gas, wind, and solar, we are actually on track with that to exceed compliance by 2 to 5%. And then a year later, ERCOT, the best grid operator in the state of Texas, in the country, updated its assessment, and they say, hey folks, here's our new projection. Because coal cannot compete with natural gas, it is going to decrease by another 40% between now and 2030. And we are going to increase the amount of wind power and solar power produced in this state by 50% from the level that we projected a year ago. And our analysis shows that when you consider that new projection by ERCOT, which by all measures is very conservative, we are on track in this state to get to 150% compliance by 2030 by doing the things that we're already doing. So, in working on these issues for the past 20 years, as we have tried to address and figure out ways to reduce pollution, to comply with state and federal levels, it was always a very difficult process because we had to figure out new ways of doing things. New technologies had to be developed. But this is the amazing thing in Texas today. We have an abundance, more than any other state, of the very things that are needed to get us into compliance. And what we really ought to be doing in this state, since we have more capacity, we have more natural gas production and more wind production than any other state. We have more potential for solar than any other state and more potential for energy efficiency. We have the unique opportunity, more than any other state, to put together a Texas energy plan, grow the state's economy, save 1 million acre-feet of water, save 1 million acre-feet of water in this drought-driven state, and create thousands and thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of new jobs. An analysis was done by an organization in 2014 that answered the question, since natural gas is cleaner than coal, what can Texas expect in terms of increased revenues associated with the increased production of natural gas to replace imported coal from other states? That analysis showed that Texas, Louisiana, and Oklahoma could expect to see their natural gas revenues increase by almost $17 billion a year. So instead of the Clean Power Plan being a noose around the neck of Texas, it actually creates a framework where Texas can utilize its abundant energy resources in every area, grow our economy, reduce air pollution, save lots of water, improve public health, and help the nation to comply with what is perhaps the most significant challenge that my children and my grandchildren face. And we can do it in a way where everything is better. Thank you. Look forward to the questions.
Thank you, John. A high note to end on. Jeff?
Well, thank you. I'm delighted to be here with Al and John and Mark, my friend Tracy Hester. I appreciate the invitation. I think you may see that in some ways we're talking past each other a bit. But I do want to just quickly point out, I think the conclusion I would draw from what John Hall had to say is that the Clean Power Plan doesn't mean anything in Texas, right? If there's no reason, so if the Clean Power Plan is struck down, presumably the state of Texas, based on the data that you shared with us, would more than comply. So in terms of what it means for the state of Texas, you might conclude, well, not very much. I don't know enough to either agree or disagree with Mr. Hall, but you might wonder then what all the fuss is about. When it comes to man-made climate change, I suspect that not all the people in this room share the same views. But I do hope and expect that we all share a basic commitment to the rule of law. By the end of the discussion today, I hope to persuade you that if you do believe in the rule of law, you should be opposed to the Clean Power Plan. No matter how much you care about climate change and the need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, I think you will see, even just with a brief discussion, that it has absolutely no basis in law. Let me start with the point that I think all of us should agree on. When it comes to regulating U.S. industry, the president only has authority given to him by Congress. That's the way our constitutional system works. He has no independent authority under the Constitution to impose regulatory restrictions on industry or business, no matter how much he wants to do so. And even if he wants to tell the international community that he's made a promise to do so, he doesn't have authority unless it's given to him by Congress. Now, normally, in the past 100 years, when the president wants to create a legacy, as this president does, he goes to Congress and he does the hard work of getting legislation that will be needed to give him the authority that he needs to leave the legacy that he wants to leave. But that's not what happened here. The administration never proposed legislation. They never did the hard work of actually coming up with a legislative proposal, working out the compromises that are already necessary. Instead, they decided to discover authority under existing law. And I'm here to tell you that the authority they've claimed simply does not exist. Now, you might say, but didn't the Supreme Court hold that EPA can regulate CO2 under the Clean Air Act? And after all, of course, the president controls EPA. That's absolutely true, but the Supreme Court didn't give EPA a roving mandate to do good. As the Supreme Court has made clear in a number of cases, EPA can regulate CO2 emissions, can regulate greenhouse gases, but only by using the tools, the programs that Congress has given to the president. That's why the administration has been forced to identify some grant of authority from Congress, some statutory hook, to accomplish what the president wants to accomplish in terms of reducing greenhouse gases. And the statutory hook they chose is probably the most famous section of the Clean Air Act. Some of you may have even heard of it. It's called Section 111D. And that's the authority that the president has pointed to support his Clean Power Plan. Now, Mark is, I think, going to talk a little bit about why this is a curious choice because of statutory language that actually prevents EPA from regulating under Section 111 if it's already regulated the same group of facilities under Section 112. But I'm going to leave that to him. I want to talk just about, even assuming that they can regulate under Section 111D, I want to tell you the way Section 111 works. So Section 111, and please, don't let your eyes glaze over. I'm going to do this very quickly, and it's very simple and very straightforward. Section 111, including Section 111D, has been part of the Clean Air Act since 1970. And until recently, it was an obscure and rarely used provision. But the administration has now completely reinterpreted this 46-year-old provision and discovered that it actually gives EPA authority to completely restructure the power sector. The administration now claims that under Section 111D, this 46-year-old section, it actually has authority to shut down power plants that it doesn't like and to require industry to build different types of power plants that the administration favors instead. But literally, by regulatory fiat, EPA simply takes business away from plants that it doesn't like, coal-fired power plants, and awards that business to plants that it does like, mostly wind and solar. There's nothing in the Clean Air Act that could possibly give EPA that authority. Now, I will tell you, EPA's entire theory is based on 4 words of the Clean Air Act that come from a regulatory definition, literally from 4 words in the Clean Air Act. There's a regulatory definition that talks about the best system of emission reduction. But EPA's theory completely ignores well-settled principles of statutory interpretation. It ignores all the other words around it. It ignores what Congress clearly intended when it drafted Section 111. Section 111 is very simple and straightforward. It says that if EPA finds that a pollution from a certain type of facility endangers public health, then EPA is required to set a standard of performance that applies to any new source of that type. So let's say we're talking about coal-fired power plants. EPA sets a standard of performance that every single new coal-fired power plant has to meet. And then, under certain circumstances, EPA can require a state to set a standard of performance for existing plants of the same type within its borders. So it's pretty easy. EPA sets a standard of performance for new plants, and then it can require states to set a standard of performance for existing plants. And the statute is very clear that it expects standards for existing plants to be less stringent than standards for new plants because it's easier to build emission controls into new plants. And the statute also specifically says that EPA shall allow a state to set less stringent standards based on the remaining useful life of a plant. Now, you may ask, what is a standard of performance? Well, the standard of performance is defined in the Act, and it's very simple. A standard of performance is a regulatory requirement, an emission limitation, that achieves a continuous emission reduction from a plant when it is being operated. When that plant, so it has to be a system of emission reduction that can be employed by a plant or installed at that plant to achieve a continuous emission reduction. EPA has ignored all of that and said, well, what we really care about here is reducing emissions from power plants as a whole. So we think that the best system of emission reduction has nothing to do with an individual plant. We're going to apply it to the entire sector, and we're going to come up with a scheme that literally requires 30% of existing power plants to shut down and requires industry to build new wind and solar plants to replace them. Now, that may be a good policy. That may be cost effective, but it has absolutely no basis in law, and that's why I think that after the Clean Power Plan is struck down, that whoever the next administration is, whoever the next president is, will be back where this president should have been, which is negotiating with Congress to come up with legislation that actually deals with the problem of greenhouse gas emissions.
That was impressive. That was literally 8 minutes precisely. The man has done very many oral arguments, I suspect.
Thank you. My name is Mark Walters. I also appreciate the opportunity to be here. To begin, I have to tell you that unlike everybody else at this table, I am not a career environmental lawyer or environmental professional. I spent most of my career before going to work for the Attorney General's office as a stand-up trial lawyer. I've tried jury and bench trials in commercial and tort cases in all sorts of subject matters. But what that means for this purpose is they said to limit our remarks to 6 to 8 minutes, and I can barely say hello in 6 to 8 minutes. But I am going to try to touch on a couple of legal points and follow that up with a couple of policy points out of the hundreds of points that have already been discussed in the press. I've picked a couple that haven't gotten as much attention as perhaps they should. When I was listening, and I apologize if I missed it, I didn't hear anybody mention the stay. Did anybody? So just in case you don't know, when we're talking about the Clean Power Plan, it's not effective right now. The U.S. Supreme Court, in an unprecedented action, stayed the effectiveness of the Clean Power Plan even before the lower appellate court, the D.C. Circuit, has had a chance to rule on it. That has never happened before, as far as anyone knows. The second point is Jeff mentioned Section 111 and Section 112, and if you've been following the legal arguments, you may hear this referred to as the 111-112 argument. Besides the subject matter that Jeff was talking about, this will also get a lot of play in the arguments in the D.C. Circuit next week. And if you're interested, although there's no live streaming of the arguments, an audio will be posted of the arguments shortly after they happen. You can go onto the D.C. Circuit's website and listen to it. Very, very briefly and very, very oversimplified, here's what the 111-112 argument is. Before the 1990 amendments to the Clean Air Act, Section 111 essentially said, if you regulate a pollutant as a hazardous air pollutant under Section 112, don't also regulate it under 111. The 1990 amendments changed that so that the statute said, EPA, if you regulate a source category under Section 112, don't regulate that same source category under 111. In 2012, EPA promulgated the Mercury and Air Toxic Standards, sometimes called the MATS rule. That regulates, under Section 112, the emission of mercury from power plants as a hazardous air pollutant. So the argument is, because power plants are a source category regulated under Section 112, they can't be regulated under Section 111. I honestly can't go any further with the argument without it taking 10 or 15 minutes, so I'm going to stop there, but perhaps we'll have a chance to discuss that more during the panel discussion. There are a couple of policy points that I'd like to make in wrapping up. The first is this. This is an unprecedented regulation. That doesn't necessarily make it illegal, but it is stretching the envelope of EPA's authority to regulate. And being a trial lawyer, I always like to try to analogize complicated things, like the Clean Power Plan, which is a very complicated rule, and the Clean Air Act, which is probably the most complex statute ever passed by Congress to something that I can understand. So here's an analogy of the Clean Power Plan as applied to your car. EPA has said, we're going to set a standard for existing power plants that is lower than the standard we're setting for new power plants, which are supposed to have the most cutting-edge technology. That's like saying, we're going to set a standard, a miles per gallon standard of 60 miles per gallon for new cars. We can't meet that right now, but by golly, we're Americans and we've got lots of gumption and initiative, and by gosh, I know we can do it. And in addition, we're going to set a standard for the car you drive now of 80 miles to the gallon. There is no technology in the world that you can put on your car that will allow you to get 80 miles per gallon, and we know that. We're counting on state and local governments to increase their public transportation options, and we're counting on you, members of the public, to carpool more, so that when you average it out on a yearly basis, your yearly average miles per gallon will be 80 miles per gallon because you'll be driving less. Is that legal? Maybe. Is it a good policy? Is that a risk that we want to run with something as fundamental and as important as electric power? Related point. EPA has said from the very beginning that the Clean Power Plan offers flexible options for states. It doesn't. It does not. It is the proverbial gun to the head. Here's one example. EPA says that if states don't want to participate, they can simply do nothing. EPA will impose a federal plan for that state, and it will be purely a matter between EPA and the privately owned generators. Under the Clean Air Act, EPA can tell coal plants not to run as much as they want to by imposing emission limitations. EPA has no authority to tell gas plants to run more to make up the difference. It has no authority to tell renewable generators to run more to make up the difference. It has no authority to tell anyone to build more sources of renewable energy. States can do it. Individual generators can decide they want to do it, but EPA can't order it. So that's the choice that's being given to those states that don't want to participate. Either you can go along with a plan that you think is both illegal and bad policy, or you can do nothing and run the risk that there will be an electricity shortfall in your state that won't be able to be made up. And when I say shortfall, I mean rolling blackouts, I mean brownouts, I mean prices going through the roof. If that happens, here's one thing that I can tell you for sure. EPA will not be able to help you. If you're sitting in Houston and it's 95 degrees and 95% humidity and your power is out so that your air conditioner is not working, EPA will not be able to help you. Sierra Club and Environmental Defense Fund will not be able to help you, and you won't be calling them. You'll be calling your power company, and next you'll be calling your local elected public officials, and not to make a campaign contribution. That is an elected official's worst nightmare, being blamed for something over which he or she has no control. That's not a choice. How am I doing on time?
You have -6 seconds.
I'll stop there.
So thank you for the opening statements. Before we start moving to questions and point counterpoint, I wanted to let everyone in the audience know that this is one of those rare times when it actually would be great to see you looking at your phones. We are getting questions, and some of them are quite excellent, but please don't forget you have an opportunity to have this great panel address some of your questions here live. With that in mind, let me just start with a larger question that may involve a little bit of prognostication, and I'll open it up for the entire panel. As Mark pointed out, there's a stay on the Clean Power Plan. That stay was issued by the U.S. Supreme Court to halt implementation of the rule, which was unprecedented. But at this point, we now have a review of that rule taking place, an oral argument for the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, the full court, which is also highly unusual. They went straight to the full court rather than a bench review. All this seems to signal that this is a rule that's going to get very close scrutiny and almost certainly get some degree of Supreme Court review. So one parlor game that many lawyers engage in is how is Justice Scalia's passage in the composition Supreme Court likely to tilt the consideration of the rule? And for those of you feeling especially bold, if you want to offer any thoughts on how perhaps a Trump administration might consider some of these rules and what sort of forecast you see, this is setting the stage for the larger question of if this rule gets struck down, what's next? What is the alternative that would make sense given the concerns we've raised here tonight? And I will ask who would like to jump on that grenade first.
Well, I'm happy to jump in on part of it. The next administration, whoever is the head of that administration, could pretty easily revoke the rule. There are, as someone who's been involved in several transitions from one party to the other, I can tell you there are some rules that are impossible to overturn. For legal reasons, for practical reasons, you can't just come in, and so it's not as though a new Trump administration is going to come in and undo everything that Obama did, because that's just not possible legally. But this particular rule, for reasons I'm happy to go into, would be pretty easy to revoke. True, they would have to explain their reasons for doing so. They would have to publish that. They would have to take comment. They would have to finalize that. But I think it's pretty clear that if there is a Trump administration, he said as much, that the rule would be revoked. You know, I made this point earlier, but I will make it again. The way to deal with this issue is the way we always deal with these major public policy issues, and that is by doing the hard work that it takes to get legislation passed through Congress. You know, the claim has been this Congress is dysfunctional. The Republicans would never allow anything like this. I don't buy that. I think there's enough interest in the business community. Now, it would require compromises. It wouldn't let the Obama or Clinton to get everything they might want, but that's the way we do things in this country. And if the rule is struck down, I do think that's where we will be, because EPA chose 111D because it thought that was the best option that it had. So in terms of a fallback option under the Clean Air Act, you know, different theories have been proposed, but they're a bit more far-fetched even than Section 111D.
Hey, Tracy, if I could step in. So in terms of what's next, you know, with all respect to Jeff, you know, he's mentioned going back to Congress for additional legislation, and in his initial remarks mentioned the rule of law, somehow implying that EPA or the White House, you know, published a rule that's untethered to statute. And, you know, one thing that Jeff didn't mention was the Massachusetts versus EPA decision, in which I
did mention that.
Well, it was what you didn't mention is a Republican-dominated bench, which, in its decision, told the Bush EPA that, in fact, they had an obligation to do something about carbon emissions. And it is, and that the Clean Air Act, as it's written today, the law of the land today, the Clean Air Act that has been responsible for cleaning the air in Houston dramatically since the time I lived as a kid here in the 1970s. I don't know those of you who were here in the 1970s living in Houston, the air quality was awful. I'm just absolutely awful. It's not great today, but it is substantially better because of the Clean Air Act. And what the Massachusetts versus EPA decision did is the Supreme Court decided, again, a Republican-dominated Supreme Court instructed EPA to do something about carbon emissions. And it is under the Clean Air, and they interpreted the Clean Air Act as it is written today, literally this minute, is giving the EPA the authority to regulate carbon emissions. And so it isn't that this effort today needs new legislation, or that this effort today is somehow untethered to the statute, that this EPA published the Clean Power Plan as well as the motor vehicle rules, these new rules on aircraft emissions, to the Clean Air Act as it's written today, which is interpreted by this Republican-dominated Supreme Court as giving them the authority to regulate carbon dioxide.
I don't have the fortune or the burden of being a lawyer. But I will say this. These gentlemen are brilliant, but there are lawyers equally brilliant on the other side who do make arguments as strong as theirs as to the validity of the Clean Power Plan. And the Supreme Court will ultimately decide this. I will share this with you. Every clean air regulation that has ever been adopted has been litigated with as much passion on each side as the Clean Power Plan. So this whole litigation bill is nothing new. It is the ordinary. And at the end of the day, when the litigation is over, we move forward and we forge effective solutions that allow us to continue to improve the quality of life of our people. I don't know what the other states ought to do if the Clean Power Plan is ruled invalid, but I have a strong opinion of what Texas ought to do. We ought to put together a Texas energy plan, grow our energy economy, create billions of additional income for our citizens and our schools, create millions of new jobs, and therefore more opportunity for all of our folks. It makes absolute great sense for the majority leader of the Senate, Mr. McConnell, and for the senators of Wyoming to be absolutely opposed to the Clean Power Plan. And that may be based on some law, but it's also based on the fact that much of the coal that is utilized in this country comes from those states, and they're fighting hard to protect what they feel is the well-being of their citizens. But I'm not sure, in light of our abundance of Texas natural gas, wind, and solar, and energy efficiency, if that ought to be the position of any public official in Texas. If we are concerned about the well-being of our citizens in terms of a healthier environment, more jobs, less water, less impact from climate change, why on God's green earth would we not utilize the resources we have, grow the economy, reduce air pollution, save water, and make this state a better place to live? So what I think we ought to be doing in Texas is putting together a Texas plan, because the Texas plan will move us forward. And I will share one other thing with you. This is the other thing that has happened. It used to be that coal-fired power plants represented the cheapest source of electricity in the country. Hydraulic fracking, which we facilitated creation in this state, changed that. In the year 2000, the cost of natural gas was $8 per MMBTU. Today it's around $2. Coal cannot compete with $2 natural gas. And coal cannot compete with wind. And coal in time will not be able to compete with solar. Why don't we take what we have an abundance of and make the right decisions for our people on every indice that one could put forth? I'm not a politician, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a scientist, but I think that 2 + 2 still equals 4.
Well, one of the resources that we have an awful lot of in Texas is coal. So I guess we won't be using that resource if we shut down all the coal plants.
We don't at this point.
You know, I think that where I think we should go next, and what I think is one of the real tragedies of the Clean Power Plan that nobody is talking about, is that we have been able to reduce carbon emissions substantially in this country on the back of cheap natural gas. I have no opposition to that, but the benefits of the Clean Power Plan itself in terms of reducing global carbon emissions, and I should just interject here, unlike other pollutants, carbon is a zero-sum game. If you're talking about particulate matter being pumped out of a plant in Houston, it doesn't have much effect in Germany. But it doesn't matter how much we reduce our carbon emissions if the main emitters of carbon keep increasing theirs. The reduction of emissions of the Clean Power Plan are about 3 weeks of China's emissions. China uses more coal to produce electric power than the United States and the European Union combined, and they are going to continue to do so. They don't have a cheap natural gas option. India is going to continue to use coal to produce electric power. They don't have a cheap natural gas option. Countries like Poland get 90% or more of their electric power from coal, and they don't have the option of reducing their emissions through cheap natural gas. The road not taken here is that we are giving up the chance to develop the technology that would be a world leader in the technology that would allow these countries to continue to provide electric power to their citizens while keeping their carbon emissions under control. We're not going to do both of those things. I'm not saying it's technologically impossible, but if we go down the Clean Power Plan road, we're not also going to make the investment in the clean coal technology that could allow us to use the coal that we have and allow those countries to use the coal that they have while still addressing the climate change problem. As to the other question that nobody answered, Justice Scalia's passing is huge. There's no question, regardless of whether you're in favor of the rule or against the rule, it's huge. The stay that the Supreme Court granted was decided 5-4. Justice Scalia was one of the 5, and I think a lot of people thought on both sides this is very bad. This is bad news for the Clean Power Plan because 5 justices on the Supreme Court are signaling that they think it has some real problems that they've granted this unprecedented stay. And then shortly after the stay was granted, Justice Scalia passed away. And if nobody is appointed in his place so that there are only 8 members of the Supreme Court, then a 4-4 tie just affirms whatever decision the D.C. Circuit makes. So that changes the calculus for the D.C. Circuit from thinking that their papers are going to be graded by a very critical audience to them having a very realistic chance of being the ultimate deciders and not the Supreme Court.
May I add something, please?
Of course, John.
And one of the things that we skipped over is that the D.C. Circuit was provided an opportunity to determine if a stay should be issued against the Clean Power Plan, and they denied that stay after hearing substantial testimony demonstrating that the capricious and arbitrary standard could not be met. So, from our perspective, we are pleased that the D.C. Circuit gets to take up this issue. And yes, the Supreme Court's decision was unprecedented. But it was also unprecedented that the Supreme Court would issue a stay without considering any evidence. They did not. They simply made a decision.
Hold on a second, John. The Supreme Court had exactly the same evidence that the D.C. Circuit had.
Yeah.
There was no testimony taken at the D.C. Circuit. There were affidavits submitted, and they were the exact same affidavits submitted at the Supreme Court.
Well,
so that's simply incorrect.
Well, again, I say I'm not a lawyer, but lawyers on the side of supporting the Clean Power Plan will also make very persuasive arguments that what the Supreme Court did in terms of issuing its stay also was unprecedented. I can't speak to it because I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not going to try to practice what I'm not. But, we have a presidential election in about 6 weeks. The American people get to go to the polls. And when we go vote, not only will we be deciding if the Clean Power Plan stay in effect or something similar to it, but just about every other major policy decision that affects the people of this country. This is an important election. And I would suggest that we ought to make sure we vote, encourage our family members and our neighbors to vote. And we are fortunate and blessed to live in a democracy. The election have consequences. And I would add this other lay thought with regard to predicting what the Supreme Court's going to do. There were a group of folks who said there's no way the Affordable Act, the Obamacare,
Affordable
made these
Care
broad
Act.
projections that there is no way that the Supreme Court is going to validate this law. And lo and behold, Chief Justice John Roberts, considered the facts and made a decision. We can procrastinate all we can make these predictions, informed predictions, but we really can't say today what the court's going to do.
I have to agree with that, but I think the key point is those justices will review the law and
That's their job.
determine whether the Clean Power Plan is consistent with the laws passed by Congress. And I'm not persuaded that the unfortunate death of Justice Scalia will really change things around, just like Justice Roberts decided that the will of Congress should be upheld in the Obamacare case. You very well may have a number of justices who were appointed by Democrats who say this goes too far.
And the hardest thing as a moderator is to not jump in and offer my viewpoints, because I have some. I will simply note that, John, if you're not a lawyer, that was a very lawyerly answer, and you should be one.
No.
I'll also point out that it was a 5-4 ruling to grant a stay. And as a result, with Justice Scalia's passing, it's almost certainly now a 4-4 split. A lot of people are reading tea leaves based on that and the way the court might go. But we need to keep in mind it was a decision to grant a stay, which actually is a different legal standard, a different burden of demonstration by the government. So to a certain extent, the question of whether the plan itself satisfies the requirements of the Act is a different one. And the court may go in a different direction. Your comments on Chief Justice Roberts may be more prescient than people expect. But at the same time, we may see what Justice, I was going to say, well, I won't speculate who the new justice might be. But if I could, I have to say we are getting an enormous number of fascinating questions. And as I was suspected, we're going to be unable to get to even 1/10 of them before the end. However, I'm still going to now ask you, keep submitting them because we're calling questions to ask. I have one that's for John, but at the same time, I think it can be easily leveraged for others to comment on as well. But essentially, I think that the question points out that we've kind of had a bit of a parochial emphasis in our discussion tonight. The question is, I understand that Texas will exceed the standard of the Clean Power Plan, and I'm very proud of my state. But what about other states that do not have an abundance of natural gas and wind? What happens to them? And how can we lead in a way that others can follow if they don't have our resources? If I could leverage that as well, we need to keep in mind the Clean Power Plan is a national plan, that it also distributes the burdens of reducing greenhouse gas emissions unevenly. It's not every state reduces exactly the same amount. So to a certain extent, how we're going to implement this plan nationally is actually a fairly complicated one. I was wondering if you had some thoughts to offer for
sure.
states who are in the same position.
We work on this issue not only in Texas, but the other 9 largest states in the country, where approximately 65 to 70% of the people of this country live and our economy operates. I can take state by state. And the same trends that are occurring in Texas at varying levels are occurring in other states. Ohio, Republican governor, Republican legislature. Utilities there, integrated utilities. Now, utilities there in that competitive environment have shut down 50% of the coal plants in Ohio over the past several years. And because of that decision, they have achieved 50% carbon reductions, 50%. They have replaced that carbon, they have replaced coal with natural gas. The same thing is happening in Illinois. The same thing is happening in California. The same thing is happening in New York. The same thing is happening in North Carolina. So, in fact, independent analysis have been done that shows that just about every state is on track to fully comply with the Clean Power Plan by 2030.
So, John, why do you care about the Clean Power Plan? If everybody's going to comply anyway, why don't you just declare victory and say, this doesn't matter, everybody's going to do it for other reasons?
I could take just about any other policy decision, and I could make that same rhetorical argument. And so I believe that policy is important.
But
I believe.
But why? So if these reductions are going to be achieved without it, what's the purpose of having this very controversial policy?
Or to put it another way, if this is going to happen anyway, why does government have to mandate it? If this is a foregone conclusion, why do we have to have the heavy hand of government, which doesn't know how to generate electric power, telling the states what they have to do?
Well, what EPA has said to the states is, states, here is a approach that we would suggest, but we hereby give you broad authority to pick the path that works best for your state. And by the way, state Illinois, you have the ability to partner with Wyoming, and together you develop a plan that makes the most sense for the two of you, and get as many of your neighboring states as well to join in. I have worked on these issues for the past 25 years. There is more flexibility afforded under the Clean Power Plan than any environmental statute ever enacted by EPA. And states are moving forward, utilizing that flexibility, making decisions that bring about these reductions. Most people...
John, I just have to interrupt again. So there are 29 states that have sued to challenge the Clean Power Plan. There are 17 states that have joined EPA's side. If you look at the burden of the reductions, 84% of the required reductions come from the 29 states that are challenging.
And let me respond.
And if you look at the 17 states that are supporting, it's like 8%.
And let me explain. The state of Texas, because of our very large industrial base and 100-degree weather, we utilize more electricity and create more carbon pollution than the combined states of California, Illinois, New York, New Jersey, Florida, and North Carolina. So a large part of that percentage is Texas, and yes, we are driving the train with Wyoming, with West Virginia on the litigation. I don't understand why we're doing that, particularly when we are 150% toward compliance on the existing policies and programs. I can't answer that question. It seems to me that would suggest that maybe Texas has some advantages and that it can partner with neighboring states to get there. We have an interstate economy, and if politicians and perhaps some of my lawyer friends would just move to the side and let the ingenuity and innovation that exists move forward to solve this problem, as is already occurring. Again, every objective analysis shows that every state is making substantial progress to comply, and that this is not going to be the substantial burden that has been projected.
And
Oh,
John, if
I'm
I
sorry,
could just
go ahead.
jump in real quick. I think another way to answer Jeff and Mark's question is perhaps why do we think it's good policy, but why are you and your clients fighting it? Because I do think that soon it will be very hard for anybody to show that they're being harmed. I think.
Let me just say, I didn't bring PowerPoint slides. You just need to know, and with all due respect, some of the facts that you are portraying are simply incorrect.
What facts?
There are many states. There are many states that would have a substantial difficulty meeting their requirements. I don't know anything about Texas, but I know a lot about a lot of other states where those state officials say, this will force us to do things that we don't want to do. This will force us to do things that will increase electricity prices for a lot of people who can't afford it, and that's why we're standing up. I think most people would be a little skeptical that states are fighting this if they could easily achieve it at no cost.
Well, I can tell you, the state of Texas is, in 2015 annual emissions, complying with its 2024 interim targets. And it's not the only one. There are other states that are on that track already. And so.
Great, then we don't need the Clean Power Plan.
Texas doesn't need to fight it either.
I haven't had a chance to respond to this, but I represented the state. I represented ERCOT. I represented the Public Utility Commission of Texas, and I represented the TCQ, and they don't agree, with all due respect, with Mr. Hall's analysis. So that's not accepted gospel. The people that are actually charged in this state with regulating the generation and distribution of electricity think that the Clean Power Plan will be a disaster for Texas. It will cause electricity rates to go through the roof. It will cause coal plants to shut down before their time and put people out of work. Now, there's no way that I can prove to you, like a geometric theorem, that that's going to happen, and there's no way that Mr. Hall and Mr. Armendariz can prove to you, like a geometric theorem, it's not going to happen. We could spend all night going back and forth on this. But here's one thing, if you look, that's related to what Jeff said. If you look at the states that are lined up against the Clean Power Plan, they're the states that are making all the electricity. The states that are joining in on EPA's side are in the bottom of electricity production. The states that are challenging
except with
it,
prices.
fair enough. The states that are challenging it are in the top. And I would submit that they are the ones that know the most about what it takes to produce reliable, efficient, cheap electricity. And we're not listening to them. And they don't agree with this. They don't agree with the facts that have been put out, and they don't agree with this analysis. So it's not simply the partisan issue that you might think it is. It is a producer and a taker issue.
Well, let me make a comment on that. Unfortunately, we have our politics is broken. And the states that are on the side of supporting the Clean Power Plan are headed by Republican governors for the most part, and the states supporting it are headed by Democrats. Our politics is broken. It has nothing to do with what is happening in our state in terms of work moving towards compliance. It's politics that are driving these decisions, pure and simple. And again, for the report that I reference, our website is www.edf.org. Everything that I've talked about tonight is on our website. And we invite you, please, go to the website, retrieve it, And you will see we didn't make up anything. We just used public reports that is available to each and every one of you by ERCOT to draw our conclusions, utilizing a utility sector financed and vetted analytical tool.
And is that for all the other states you mentioned too? Do you have data, same kind of information?
Can yes, let me call the roll. Texas is on track to achieve almost 150% compliance with the Clean Power Plan. California is on track to comply and exceed. New York State is...
But that wasn't my question. My question is, are these studies that you say support these conclusions, are they all available on your... And again, you may know more about Texas than I do.
They may be on our website. I can't speak to that, but I know that there have been national studies completed that show that practically every state is on track.
Right, so the Clean Power Plan makes no difference
So,
under
John,
that theory.
if I could, then, since we're live on video and it's going to the web, if anyone would like to get a copy of the studies, can they email you directly?
Yes, and I will pass your emails on to my able staff, and we will be glad to send you a copy of the report. It's online. We will send you an electronic copy, so when we put together our study, we went over and we met with our friends at ERCOT, and we said, look, you are the experts in terms of electricity in this state. Here is our draft report. Please review it, critique it, give us your feedback. They did their job, and they didn't provide us feedback, but 3 days later, they issued a report. And in issuing that report, the press was very much aware of our report that had been released 3 days before, and they asked the ERCOT leadership, they said, what is your reaction to the EDF report that was released on Tuesday, that was released on Friday? And they responded by saying, we see lots of consistencies between our conclusions and theirs. ERCOT is the best grid operator in the state. Perhaps what we ought to be talking about is how we can extend ERCOT's expertise to the rest of the country. Because one of the reasons we are where we are is because we've got a great grid operator, and it is integrated wind into our grid with no problems.
Well, we also have the fortune of having our own grid, which helps considerably in that process. I will simply make a comment as prerogative as moderator, and as a transition to try and capture some of the questions, I'm going to combine several into one comment, because Mark's response about other greenhouse gas emissions from other sovereign nations has struck a nerve. I'll simply say, John, you may be absolutely correct on the trends, and Jeff, you may be exactly correct as to why we need a clean power plant. The trends are going in that direction. I'll simply point out that there is a separate value to commitment, to a sense of that even if the trends are this way now, signing on the bottom line that this trend will be adhered to and promulgated as a matter of law has a value in terms of making long-term capital investment decisions. And perhaps I'll get shouted down, but I've actually heard dark rumors that because of the market switch right now, there's market forces that are driving the price of coal downward, and that at some point markets being fluid, we may be in areas of the country where coal may be competitive, and we need to have some sort of policy direction as to which way that type of resource will be used. One of the reasons why we might need that commitment is because, as of this moment, we have signed an international agreement that is committing the United States to reduce our greenhouse gases. And there have been several who have been asked about the fact that China's continuing its emissions, several others who are concerned about whether or not they are going to learn from our example. I was curious, since our time is running short, taking the bigger picture here, any thoughts on how our commitments on the Paris Agreement factor into the Clean Power Plan? Does that change the legal posture for it? And any thoughts as well going forward, and whether or not this might be setting the stage for the next act if the Clean Power Plan is overturned? Several questions have asked about whether or not this is all prelude to a carbon tax.
I'll take a couple of those just very quickly. In terms of what the Paris Agreement means for the Clean Power Plan, I don't know that there's a direct legal connection between the two, but I certainly think that international leadership is absolutely critical. Again, if you look at carbon emissions since the start of the Industrial Revolution, no country has put more CO2 into the atmosphere than the United States. We are overwhelmingly responsible for a massive share of the problem. If you look at our large trading partners in Canada and Western Europe, Japan and South Korea, the industrialized world has put a disproportionate amount of the carbon in the atmosphere compared to its population. And so, in contrast to Mark's position, using China and India as excuses, it's fantastic that we're in Houston. The engineers and physicists at the Johnson Space Center didn't wait until China and India put people on the moon to win the space race. They're not going to wait until China and India put people on Mars to solve the climate problem. We shouldn't wait for people in developing countries to solve problems related to medical issues, whether it's polio or Ebola or malaria. We are Americans. We are Texans. We lead. It's what we do, and it's very important. And American leadership on this issue is going to be absolutely critical to solving the problem, especially given that we are the country, when you look at a per capita emission, is disproportionately responsible for creating that problem in the first place.
And I would add this, in the Paris Agreement, China and India made substantial commitments in terms of reducing their carbon. We have a small staff that works in China and India and much of Asia and much of Europe. The trends that we have underway in the United States are occurring in those states as well, in those countries as well. I would add one other thought. My 3 daughters and my grandchild, whom I love, and their cohorts may be our best hope. Because when you look at them and where they stand on this issue, it ain't even close. And there is a chance that the Supreme Court may invalidate the Clean Power Plan, but this is my optimism. There's a group of young people who will be our leaders tomorrow, and they will have the wisdom to do perhaps what we do not choose to do.
Can I make just a couple of quick points? It is incorrect to say that we made commitments in Paris. Nobody made commitments, right? I mean, they're not legally binding in any way. They're political, and the president made that very clear when he said, well, we don't need to submit it for Congress for ratification.
Absolutely. There's no treaty codification that require ratification by the Senate. There were interpretations of prior treaty commitments we've made.
No. The UNFCCC is very clear in terms of what it requires.
Yes.
And that requires annual reporting and record keeping. There's no basis whatsoever for commitments in terms of future emission reductions. Now, the commitment made by China is that its emissions will peak by 2030. Doesn't say how high they'll go, but they basically say, well, we will continue to increase our emissions as much as we need to grow our economy until 2030, and then what we will endeavor to do is to have those come down at that point. So all this business about the Paris commitment is simply incorrect. Those are kind of best efforts, goals that were set by a number of companies. And then the last point I would make is this. I have 4 children too. I hope to have grandchildren. And certainly we want to leave them with a better world, even a better world than we have today. The only way we will meet our goals is through technology development. We're not going to solve the world's problems by getting wind farms and solar plants around the world. The economics just don't work. They just don't work. And so, as Mark said, one of the things that we've always done is create incentives for technology development. And given the amount of coal-fired generation and the coal resources around the world, what we need to do is to put in place policies that will lead to technology developments that will allow people to use that resource to produce the goods and services that they want in their countries, and to do it in a way that has lower carbon emissions. And the Clean Power Plan forecloses that as a practical matter.
Mark, you may get the final word here.
Okay, fair enough. Well, I think that what Jeff said is very true, and I want to be clear. I did not say and am not saying, let's let India and China solve the problem. I'm saying that by going down the Clean Power Plan road, we are giving up the opportunity to be the world leader in developing the technologies that will allow those other countries to use the resources that we have. And I guess I would close with this. By all means, inform yourself, check out the plan on EDF's website, but there's been a lot of talk from Mr. Hall about how good ERCOT is, so please read ERCOT's report as well. ERCOT says that the Clean Power Plan will raise your electricity rates by 20% or more. ERCOT says that that we cannot get the amount of renewable energy onto the grid in Texas that the Clean Power Plan assumes we can in anywhere near the time that it wants us to, and that's based on their actual experience integrating the wind energy that we have, which is more than any other state, into the grid. And ERCOT says that reliability will be a problem. That's ERCOT's words, not my words. It's interesting that the moonshot analogy was mentioned, because that's really what we're doing here is we don't have the technology right now for the world to meet the emission goals that we have. As Americans, we want to do something. We cannot stand to not do anything. I'm not saying that we shouldn't do anything, but I'm saying that a regulation that has few benefits and costs a lot of money is not a good solution to the problem.
And with that, after having promised Mark the last word, I'll say one last thing. First, I want to remind everyone that if I remember correctly, there's a reception afterwards, so please stay and join us. And perhaps you'll hear Jeff and I argue about the Paris Agreement a little bit more. And also, at the risk of setting the seeds for a future symposium, I wanted to remind everyone to take a step back and realize that all of our conversation tonight is focused exclusively on the power sector, in particular the fossil fuel power sector, which is really the Clean Power Plan is a proof of principle and whether or not this regulatory approach will work. If it is upheld, it can be applied in other sectors. So think about having this same discussion at some point in the future dealing with the refining sector or other greenhouse gas intensive sectors. And you guys, the stakes here actually go beyond just energy. They go deeper into the economy itself. So with that, would you please join me in thanking our panel for a fabulous discussion.
I'm Radhakrishnan, and I'm the Managing Director of UH Energy at the University of Houston. I would like to thank our panelists, Armendariz, John Hall, Jeffrey Homestead, and Mark Walters, and our moderator, Tracy Hester. Thank you all for taking the time from your busy schedules to be here. I'm sure you will all agree it has been a terrific discussion. We would like to, as a token of our appreciation, we have some plaques for each one of you, and they are inside your red bags, so it's easy for you to carry them.
Season tickets to the football?
There may be a little lottery ticket there, which takes you to the football game. I'd like to thank our media sponsor, the Houston Public Media. A big thanks to UH Energy student ambassadors. You would have seen them guiding us as we walked in, who volunteered their time to make this tonight a success. They were also helped in their efforts by students of the Energy Coalition. So we invite you to stay for the reception. As Tracy mentioned, momentarily all those doors will open, and we have refreshments on the other side. Just go ahead, enjoy the refreshments. Also use the opportunity to network with your friends. And if you have any further questions for the panelists, Those who are staying back, just definitely we will take advantage of it. We look forward to seeing you at the next symposium, which is on November 29th, and it is on shale development in Texas. And you can always visit for more details our website, which is www.uh.edu/energy. Enjoy the reception. Thank you very much.